The FDA statement says it's still not ready to reauthorize the Emergent BioSolutions facility to reopen as a vaccine manufacturing plant, as they continue to work through issues with both the facility and Johnson & Johnson. The plant was shut down in April after it reported that J&J doses were likely contaminated by a drug material intended for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was also being manufactured at the same plant. While the Federal Health Agency did affirm that some batches thought to represent around 10 million J&J doses are suitable for use, The Times reports that 60 million doses have been ordered discarded, which could have implications for 2 million doses compounded, finished and packaged by Aspen Pharmacare in Gqeberha. It's unclear which batch the materials sent to South Africa represent, as timelines now become key. The FDA also Thursday extended the shelf life of the J&J vaccine from 3 months to 4.5 months after tens of thousands of doses were set to expire in the United States by the end of the month. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Well, for an update on that story, we cross to our New York correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, it's been a long-awaited decision and it creates a bit of doubt for South Africa.
But not the clarification that everybody has been waiting to hear, Peter, as it relates to those 2 million doses that are sitting at that Gqeberha facility run by Aspen Pharmacare. What the FDA statement tells us is 3 things in the main. They are saying that a certain 2 batches of the J&J vaccine manufactured at the Emergent BioSolutions plant will continue to receive authorized use in terms of the emergency use authorization afforded the J&J vaccine in the United States. 10 million of those doses are going to be okay for use in the United States or otherwise. The second thing we learn from the FDA statement is this. The FDA has determined that several other batches are not suitable for use, but additional batches are still under review, and the agency will keep the public informed once those reviews are completed. So the New York Times telling us that they are there referring to the 60 million doses. And the implication of that is that it could affect the 2 million that are waiting for approval in South Africa. Is it part of the 60 million vaccine batches that they are referring to? The third thing we learn from the FDA statement is that they have sent a letter of authorization for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to help facilitate potential export to other countries. I'm reading here, under the revised letter of authorization, the distribution and administration of exported vaccines must comply with the laws of the recipient countries. What do the laws of a recipient country like South Africa tell us? It needs to be approved for use by the local health regulator, SAPRA, which is the equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration. What we are now seeing from the South African Health Department is a statement of their own, essentially confirming what we've just heard from the FDA. What are the implications of this decision? They say the vaccine awaiting distribution from Gqeberha needs further assessment by SAPRA, and it is SAPRA that will soon advise if they are suitable for use in South Africa. So in one instance, Peter, you have the FDA saying, hey, it's going to be for authorities in your home country to decide. The South Africans now acknowledging that, saying that there is a real possibility that these vaccines may not be suitable for use. However, this is for the South African regulator to advise on. So that's where we are. There's some batches of those J&J vaccines that will be used, around 10 million. 60 million will now be discarded. And then, of course, you know, who's going to basically take responsibility for approving those vaccines? I think the FDA here deferring to SAPRA in terms of whether those can be verified as suitable for use, the 2 million I'm referring to in Gqeberha.
All right. I suppose key to this is just knowing where our 2 million doses sit in terms of the batches that came out of Emergent BioSolutions. And once we know that, then the next set of decisions can be made.
Yeah, and I think it begs the question, what's taking them so long in terms of determining the timelines of what went out? I mean, everything is recorded, everything is tabulated. Surely they know which batches were contaminated. Remember, the Emergent BioSolutions plant in Baltimore, Peter, was shut down by the FDA due to these cross-contamination concerns as far back as April. So the contamination likely happened in February, March, or into April before the shutdown. So you've now had a number of months or several weeks of investigation by the FDA, which surely should be able to determine what was sent to South Africa, which batch was that from, and whether that includes the 60 million that they are talking about discarding. I don't know what the complication is here. You cannot get a direct answer from the FDA. Their statement issued does not even refer to 10 million batches that can be used in the United States, doesn't refer to the 60 million. This is a New York Times report, based on their own sources, giving us a number here of the number of batches, of number of vaccine doses that will now have to be destroyed. And we still don't know if that includes the materials that were sent to South Africa for the compounding and the completion of the packaging of those vaccines by a Johnson & Johnson subsidiary known as Aspen Farm Care. They completed the packaging in South Africa, but they are not sure if the material sent from Emergent BioSolutions was contaminated. So we need to understand timelines here. When did they send it? Which batch did it include? And does it impact the 2 million waiting for approval in South Africa?
And at the same time, earlier in the week, we heard from the WHO saying that we shouldn't wait for the FDA, that we should go ahead and use the Johnson & Johnson vaccines.
I think what the WHO, Peter, was referring to was the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, barring the issues of contamination. This is a very specific. So basically, there's a Johnson & Johnson manufacturing plant in the Netherlands that hasn't got contamination issues. And I think, if I understand the WHO correctly, they're saying go ahead and use those J&J vaccines. They are absolutely fine, very effective, safe, and effective against the various COVID-19 variants. This is a very specific period that we're referring to. It could be a matter of weeks, it could be a matter of months when this contamination happened. So this is very specific to whether materials that were meant to be used in the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was also being manufactured at the Emergent BioSolutions plant in Baltimore, whether that material it was transferred into J&J, materials that were then shipped off to places like Gqeberha for completion of, the completion of the vials and so forth. So it's a very specific thing we're trying to understand here. Do the vaccines in South Africa relate to that period of contamination in Baltimore? And if so, is it part of the 10 million that the FDA is now saying can move forward, despite having been manufactured at Baltimore plant, can now be move forward in terms of emergency use authorization in the United States and elsewhere? These are questions now that seem to be falling to the South African regulator, SAPRA, and it's from SAPRA now where we are going to get, I think, some closure as to whether these can go ahead or not.
Yeah, and again, questions being raised here about approving other drugs like the Sinopharm and the Sputnik 5. The EFF are going on about that. But the shelf life of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 been extended to 4.5 months, which will be a great help, I guess, as well.
It'll be a great help for those 2 million vaccines if we can get approval for them, Peter. Shelf life doesn't really factor into the equation if those vaccines need to be, discarded. But certainly some good news for uncontaminated J&J vaccines. There was some concern that their lifespan would exceed its limits after 3 months. The FDA giving a decision yesterday extending that by some 6 weeks to 4.5 months. And also the big concern was that a number of J&J vaccines, uncontaminated ones, that have been shipped around to various states in the United States were sitting idly, and the concern was that they were going to the expiration was going to run out by the end of this month, and then those too would have to be discarded, and just the difficulty that would confront the U.S. administrators, given just the huge vaccine inequity we are facing around the world, to be throwing away any uncontaminated vaccines is just an affront to so many countries like South Africa that are desperate for these vaccines. So good news in terms of the lifespan for those vaccines that might have been destroyed, perfectly good vaccines that might have been destroyed, and how that could also now factor into President Joe Biden's announcement at the G7 yesterday of the 500 million doses, in addition to 80 million doses already promised by the end of June. A lot of those were going to include some of the J&J vaccines approved for use here in the United States, Peter.
Do we know if there are other countries in the same situation as South Africa where they've got J&J vaccines and they're not quite sure whether they're in this batch or not?
I don't know the answer to that. I imagine there might be. Our focus has very much been on South Africa. Yeah, it's a great question, Peter. Let me dig into that and see if I can come up with an answer. You know, there might be other countries facing a similar equation here, but I think the real concern for a country like South Africa that has been lagging in terms of its distribution and administration of vaccines is that to have 2 million vaccines. Remember what happened to AstraZeneca. Remember we had to send AstraZeneca doses back or donate them to the rest of the world, where questions around its efficacy was raised as it related to the variant first discovered in South Africa. This is just another concern for South African authorities as they are now pushing, Peter, to scale up their efforts, given the consternation that faces so many parts of South Africa in terms of rising numbers, a third wave in COVID-19, you know, to not now have access to the potential that these 2 million doses might have represented, given the climate, the vaccine climate in South Africa today is a real big issue that South African authorities are going to struggle to grapple with in the days ahead.
All right, Sherwin, we're going to leave it there, but yeah, the mystery remains. How come by now we have no idea whether our batches were in that contaminated batch or not? And what will SAPRA actually do about it? Sherwin, thanks very much indeed. No doubt we'll be chatting G7 and other issues in the coming days. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Peter.